Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day two. I hope you enjoyed our virtual exhibit halls this morning and possibly some virtual pastries. My name is Tyrone Magby, partner at ISG, and I'll be your host today for the business continuity stream. Our first presentation is jam packed. It's focused on building the digital ecosystem for resilience with a focus on implications for sourcing network, cloud, SaaS, and services. For this session today, we have four presenters. I would like to introduce Dee Anthony, Ed Armstrong, Phil Hugus, and Dieter Thompson. If you have any questions for them, please enter your questions in the session Q&A section located on the right-hand side of your screen. With that, I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Thanks, Tyrone. Hi, it's Phil Hugus here, folks. Good morning, everybody, and hope you're having a great day two of the ISG Source IT Conference. As Tyrone mentioned, I'm pleased to be joined today by three esteemed colleagues. My name's Phil Hugus. I am the ISG partner for our Network Select Channel Solutions program, and really thrilled to be joined by Dieter Thompson, the partner and president of ISG Network and Software Advisory, Ed Armstrong, a director in our software advisory business, and last but certainly not least, Dee Anthony, a director in ISG's digital solutions business. Welcome, gentlemen, and thanks for joining me today. We look forward to your feedback and commentary, and certainly some questions from our virtual audience. We're going to talk a little bit about today, guys, building the digital ecosystem with the key theme of resilience, as Tyrone mentioned in the introduction, across sourcing the network, the cloud, SaaS, and services. As the enterprise embarks on its digital journey, the resulting digital ecosystem becomes the lifeblood of the enterprise. Creating resilience in the midst of this transformation is paramount as every enterprise goes through some version of this transformation today. In essence, we must connect all of the dots in the sourcing lifecycle. The network enables connectivity to the cloud, where then SaaS becomes the bundled delivery mechanism for that services functionality that every enterprise is chasing on that transformation journey. Thusly, we're considering what are the dependencies and the commonalities that we face in this sourcing journey? What are the trends as the enterprise proceeds in this process? In the post-COVID world, being connected, having redundant, stable networks is the linchpin for all of this transformation to work. Then you layer in IoT and edge computing and other elements, and it causes the clients to think through how best to consider these interdependencies in terms of architecting and sourcing and contracting in this new ecosystem. One interesting piece of research from the most recent ISG index from June of 2020 suggests that second quarter year-over-year cloud-based as a service spend will actually increase by 6.9%, even with the impact of the pandemic in the first half of 2020. And even more interestingly enough, first half 20 to second half 20 is expected to increase by over 10% in the same category, thus showing all the more importance of a well-crafted and resilient sourcing strategy to guide you on your digital transformation. Let's start with a question on the network to Dieter Thompson. Dieter, network transformation is the critical event for virtually every enterprise today of every size, large and small, global and domestic. As enterprises proceed on that digital pivot, how are they adapting their networks to the new reality to deal with things like workforce support, technology utilization, bandwidth consumption, cloud transformation? What's the journey that they're going on right now?
Yeah, great question, Phil, and thanks, and good morning to everybody. I think, as you had mentioned, Phil, that network is really the core technology now that's enabling digital transformation, all the things that we're going to talk about today. One of the things, though, I believe in every discussion, you have to look at what has COVID done. And what I think has happened, and as you said, in the post-COVID environment, as we look at 2021, I think our new normal is forcing enterprises to look at network and start designing them a little bit differently and deploying them much more rapidly than we had been on the journey in the past. And the way we look at the technology today is really three pieces. We have the management layer, who's going to enable the technology, deploy and manage it for you. You have the technology layer itself within SD-WAN, which I think is the technology of choice. There are a lot of options and flavors. And then the last piece of that is the decision around connectivity. People are starting to move away from private MPLS-based networks into broadband aggregation with LTE or 5G backups. So understanding who's going to manage it, how you're going to manage it, what technology you're going to deploy, and then how are you going to achieve that. And of course, with all the things that you mentioned, cloud, SaaS, compute engine, those type of things, you have to have a always on, always resilient network that connects all the different ecosystems that prior to COVID you didn't have to necessarily do, which is your employees, your clients, your vendors, and so you have to then build a network that can support those ecosystems. And I think because of this remote work, which we're going to continue to see in the future, 2021 and on, you're going to have to push everything into the cloud to make it available to all the people in those ecosystems. So you really have to start with you have to get a UC platform together. You have to understand your collaboration strategies, and then you have to build a strategy around those three pillars to build your network out to support the business.
So Dieter, along that, you mentioned the three layers, and the enterprise should be looking to that overlayer, that management layer first. It sounds like the days of dump all of your traffic onto one carrier and let them do everything for you are over. As your team sees some of the largest global network transformation engagements going on right now that are moving the network forward so that we can do some of these other things in digital transformation. Talk about the carriers in that management layer versus other firms. What are we seeing from a management layer perspective? The days of dumping it all on one provider seem to be over.
Yeah, absolutely they are. And part of that is the enablement of SD-WAN and having to make moves away from private networks. But we haven't seen an opportunity that we've consulted on where we have that one monolithic global spend looking for transport as well as management across the entire enterprise. And that's a couple reasons. Again, I think broadband as a transport medium has now become very, very relevant. And that really becomes a footprint and access play versus a global strategy. SD-WAN enables you to connect multiple providers together for that ecosystem. You also you have a lot of new entrants in the market in the last 5 years that have specific niche plays. And I think you can buy best in class, and you might have 6 to 10 different vendors making up your ecosystem, which then gets into the management layer and how do you take care of that. But yeah, the days of buying a giant global network with one provider have been gone for a couple years, and certainly don't see that returning anytime soon.
So Dieter, one more for you before we pivot to D. So D, we're coming to you. You're up next. Who's best suited to take the client on the journey? It sounds like the enterprise, large or small, is facing a pretty withering set of selections out there on who do they pay attention to, who helps them go on the journey.
Great question. First, I think you need to have a solid advisor that has a lot of depth in that space. Obviously, ISG believes that that's capability that we bring to our clients. But really, I think the days of managing in-house, managing yourself, are probably also really not that relevant because of the complexity of what it takes to build these networks now. There are a lot of different options. The carriers still have a very active network management. In fact, in many cases, they'll even look the other way relative to transport, or are more interested in the managed services components. We see a lot of the Indian pure plays and a lot of the outsourcing companies seeing that the next big thing is outsourcing the management of network versus other IT functions. And then there's a number of niche players. We're seeing a lot of the VARs, the larger VARs, starting to get into that management opportunity. So it really, you have to run a process, look at multiple different layers, and find the right company that suits what your requirements are. But clearly starting with that and then working your way down the stack to technology and then transport is the way to go. And really having one global management provider does seem to be the direction most of our clients are going, even though they're bifurcating perhaps even the technology and certainly the transport.
So have a strategy is the most important thing. Focus on the overlay to find that global management, that integrator, and then focus
Correct.
on sourcing, transport, and technology after that. That's the
With
play to set up that.
Yeah, and make sure you have input from that management provider because they're the ones that have to deal with it. Because
Perfect.
I've seen clients go off and do it backwards, and then they don't have a good matchup with the provider that they chose and the tool sets and the capabilities that they have.
All right, great. Dee, thanks for that. I appreciate it very much. We're going to come back to everybody with a question about how we stay on top of that as sourcing advisors. But I want to switch over to Dee Anthony. Good to see you again, sir. And as we talk a little bit about the work that you and your team are doing in digital, everything is digital, right? And everybody's got a little bit of a different definition around it. But what are the best ways to understand that the enterprise can understand the interdependencies when thinking about the overall business case for a digital platform? For example, solution A may have lower resilience or reliance on the network, but lower functionality for its user community. Solution B may require more human labor. Solution C may have the most sophisticated SaaS functionality. As the enterprise lines up all of these options, how do they manage the interdependencies? Can you spend a few minutes and take us through what your team is seeing today as the enterprise manage those interdependency digital transformation?
Certainly, Phil. So one of the elements is if you think of bookends, Dieter's on one end of the bookend, and I'm sort of on the other, with I guess Ed in between and yourself in between. And what I mean by that is the focus that I have is around collaboration and experience. And it was very apparent when the shelter-in-place orders came down that it really hadn't been considered for most organizations as to what the impact was going to be. The experience of everybody that trying to get on the VPN that was only geared for maybe 20% of the organization. Everybody trying to use their voice in UCC, which Dieter sort of talked about, solutions that may have been in-house in some cases, especially with some third-party products. All of a sudden trying to ride that same bandwidth and virtual desktops and those things. So for us, we tend to look at it a little bit differently from the top side, if you want to think of it like that. We need to understand what the critical portions of your business value stream is and understand what key technical capabilities support that, right? So if you think about it in terms of something as simple as receiving an invoice, right? Currently, it might be via email or it might be B2B. In the future, most organizations that are looking to digitize, if you want to think of it like that, are looking to do that in such a way that there's no paper trail of such. So that's the easiest to think about. As it goes through understanding the value and then the implications, many organizations have gone through a very rapid procurement process for these online systems as opposed to internal systems. They couldn't get people into their facilities for the most part in some cases, and B, for their co-location facilities, they couldn't get people into those facilities either. And so for us, trying to enable an organization that was in the process or thinking about going digital prior to the lockdowns and everything was very difficult. And those organizations that had gone digital and had opened up their SD-WANs and had made it more of a broadband-based type of environment where anybody can compute from anywhere, which has severe implications on the network, as an example, and also the software archetype. That's a pretty hard question to break, especially when you don't know all the variables associated with how the provider is working, how the software provider is sourcing, and how they're providing their services. So for us, understanding where the value comes from and understanding what's valuable and then making the shift as a part of either pre-COVID, post-COVID, or during COVID is a pretty big nut to crack, quite frankly. And I know that many providers were already at their limits of being able to provide support because of the onslaught.
Dee, are you still there? Did we lose you?
I'm here. Can you see? Yeah,
No,
I've
I was
lost.
looking. I think we lost D'Anthony's connection.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay. So Ed, let's pivot to you. I want to come back to D when he comes back and ask him a question about what they're seeing in their engagements with the enterprise and degree of preparation. But as soon as D gets his connection back, Ed, we're going to come to you. And unfortunately, we have a great picture of you and not your smiling face. But I love your haircut, my friend. Let's talk a little bit about SaaS. You know, there seems to be a common trend here. Let's talk a little bit about SaaS, if you will, and what your experiencing with your clients in our engagements in software advisory. What responsibility did the software providers have, from a provider community perspective, have in providing a resilient, on-demand solutions platform as we get to that point in the sourcing transaction? D'Anthony kind of made the point about network being on one end and the digital transformation process being on the other side, but both network and software advisory sort of are in the middle in some of those pieces. In our software advisory business plays a critical role in that digital transformation. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing from the providers and that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely, Phil. So I think Dieter queued it up very nicely. So when Dieter talked about the necessary infrastructure and the bandwidth that's necessary to create a digital ecosystem and to support that digital ecosystem with the necessary infrastructure, that is a primary responsibility of the SaaS providers. So when you think about SaaS, unlike installed software, the SaaS providers are responsible for managing the complete spectrum of the traditional IT resource stack, everything from application, security and integration, database, servers, virtualization, storage, and networking. And so I would argue that if a SaaS provider out there is unable to guarantee some level of resiliency as measured by a performance metric like uptime, and that performance metric is below the industry standard today of 5 nines, then you really have an issue. And it's really incumbent upon the customer to look at the type of workloads that they're looking to drive into the cloud. So for example, when you're looking at SaaS and you're talking about interfacing that SaaS application to traditional enterprise software, it raises a lot of complexity with respect to the type of interface and the type of business processes that would be driven by that versus connecting SaaS to SaaS. So resiliency is the sole provenance of the SaaS provider because it's the crux of how they market their product. When they go to market, the assumption that the customer makes is that they're going to experience low to zero latency, given the fact that if they're able to source a direct internet access pipe to hit the SaaS provider's domain, that they're going to have high availability. And so one of the things that I see with my clients today is more of a focus on price. And I think that the unfortunate part about COVID is that it's accentuated the focus on price as opposed to the provisioning model and the capability of the SaaS provider to ensure that the traditional IT resource stack is accessible to its user community. And one of the things that perhaps is a benefit of SaaS is clients have become more demanding around that uptime requirement and the resolution requirement that they're looking to derive from their providers. The old model was, let's focus on driving a credit based on defects in service. Right. The new model is, let's engage to ensure that the underlying infrastructure is there to support that. And the one byproduct now that I'm seeing and advising my clients on is engaging with the SaaS provider and asking and requiring that they provide you with a SaaS continuity plan based on the KPIs that you've established to ensure access to the system.
So SaaS continuity speaks to the subject at hand in terms of resilience and those kinds of things. And Ed, knowing your business a little bit from working with Dieter and Bill Huber and others, and Tyrone and others in the software advisory business, you're often right in the middle of a critical transaction at the wrong time for the enterprise. Contract is expiring and those kinds of things. How are your enterprise clients in software advisory sort of massaging these critical software transactions into their overall digital transformation. That sort of speaks to what Dee Anthony was talking about and Dieter before, about it sort of is underpinned by the network, and then lots of things happen in the middle, and then you get to the digital transformation. And Dee, I want to come back to you now that we've got your network back up. But Ed, could you talk a little bit about what how are the enterprises behaving, and how are the providers behaving in this? And because we often see those critical software transactions become sort of emergencies, if you will.
Yeah, so COVID has driven a reactive culture as opposed to being a proactive culture. I think that before COVID hit, we just all took for granted that the networks would be there, that access to the SaaS platforms, the availability rates would be in the 5 nines. But what we're seeing today, at least from my vantage view, is customers or clients taking a more deliberate approach, in that they're looking at the complexity of the interface that they're looking to shift into the cloud. They're looking, if you're talking about PaaS or IaaS, they're looking at the workloads and access to those workloads to ensure that the organization is able to drive continuity of service. The other element which I raised was this concept of SaaS business continuity, which is really engaging with the SaaS provider to understand how they're going to be able to shift that service in the event of a major disruption in the ecosystem. So, price still is a consideration, because when you're reacting and you're in let's say you have an agreement, and that agreement is measured on consumption, and now you have a paradigm where your consumption is doubled or tripled, and you're locked into a pricing mechanism that doesn't allow elasticity, meaning as I climb or consume more, my price per gig or per meg or whatever the metric is based on the egress and ingress rate of the data drops. So it's really trying to plug into the provider and lay out a picture based on the pricing requirements that COVID has driven, based on the unpreparedness of the enterprise to deal with a unprecedented event like this.
And Ed, are the providers behaving? There are probably a few on the call today, so I'll ask a little bit of a provocative question. Are they behaving, or is it all tied to the risk profile, as many negotiations are?
It's really tied to what I would call, Phil, the engagement quotient, meaning how you're able to structure that relationship with the provider so that they're a key enabler as opposed to somebody that you're dialing up for price. The reality is that SaaS is really just elastic one way, meaning although I can continue to consume more and more of the software based on the licensing or the subscription licensing metric, I can't really true down. So one of the things that we're helping our clients with is, how do you reframe the value narrative, the relationship narrative with the SaaS provider, so that you're compelling that SaaS provider to provide unconventional solutions to problems that the client is experiencing based on an agreement which creates a static position from a pricing perspective that locks you in on a pricing mechanism that you can't true down on based on the impact of COVID to their business. And in a lot of cases, the providers are resistant, because the way that SaaS is, the revenue recognition mechanism for SaaS is predicated on revenue certainty. So it has an impact when you're coming back and you're asking that SaaS provider to reduce costs. But there are instances where we've seen SaaS providers come to the table, and it really has to do with how you frame the value of the service as a enabler in driving business outcomes for that enterprise, based not on a price paradigm, but really a relational paradigm. How critical are they in driving the outcomes that your business is committed to the marketplace?
So Ed, you made an interesting comment, getting the provider to take a static position and do something unusual, right?
Correct.
So that's all part of the process. Dee Anthony, I want to swing back to you since we've got you back, and we're heading closely here to the Q&A kind of thing. Dee, if you could just make a comment about what you're seeing your enterprise clients do as we get to that other end of the digital transformation cycle. And guys, we're going to pivot into a few questions for the audience in our last 5 minutes or so here. So Dee Anthony, you want to have a couple of minutes on that?
Yep, just 30 seconds on resiliency. No matter how the provider builds it, no matter how the network carrier carries it, always the last 50 yards that are important. As I dropped off, obviously, from the network. So there you go. Days of hearing the pin dropper is not as important as they used to be, I guess.
And the pin drop
Seeing
firm's
from
not even around anymore, right?
exactly. What we're seeing organizations do is we're beginning to see, and I'll use a word that we use trenches, but the reality is we're beginning to see organizations chunk up their work when it comes to digital transformation, so that a given portion of work, and use the little a for agile, if you will, not the big A. We're seeing them beginning to say, here's a piece of work. It might be just 3 weeks long, as an example. What's the value? What is the indicator at the end that this performed as we expected it to perform? And what that's really creating is creating havoc in most procurement organizations, because they want to procure the entire thing all at once. But the more enlightened, I guess, organizations that we're dealing with have built this mechanism by which you get seed funding to do a, not a project, but maybe a program or a product. And they build that product and they move on to the next one and move on to the next one. So for us, that kind of creates havoc with the traditional sourcing methods. And oftentimes the providers aren't ready to do that. The software development providers, they are, because they're used to doing things in chunks. But the further you get down the stack, the more static you want it to be. And
Okay.
that's what I have here, Phil.
I appreciate that, Dee. Thank you, guys. Hey, one question for all of you, and I think what we'll do is we'll go Dieter, Ed, and Dee Anthony in that order, and then we'll get into some of the Q&A from our listeners. How is the enterprise staying on top of all of these interdependencies? The obvious, easy answer is get a good advisor, and I think we talked about that a little bit before, whether that's one of your current providers or an independent advisor. But as you guys look at the unique pieces of your world in network, software, and digital, the best of breed enterprises, how are they staying on top of all of these interdependencies? Are there a couple of sort of key things from your perspective that the best of breed approach that we're seeing as we work with our enterprise clients? Dieter Thompson, you want to go first, and then we'll have Ed chime in, and then Dee Anthony third.
Yeah, it's a good question, Phil, and it is a struggle, I think, that most enterprises are having a hard time with the two functions, right? Keeping what they have up and running while also investigating all the new technologies and vendors and options. And so I think it really comes down to building your core team, both the internal team and how you organize yourself to keep up with that technology, and how you surround yourself with external advisors. Because there's really no way that any one or two people can keep up with all the different pieces and the changes that are happening so rapidly now to build and maintain the type of network that's required for all these business functions. So it's really how you manage your team and get the right team around you.
Okay, so it's all about the team. Ed, you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, absolutely. Dieter is absolutely correct. It's establishing an architectural review board where you're looking at every component of what that digital ecosystem can look like. So, for example, my job is to help clients negotiate software, but software comes in many different packages. So you've got a client. The client says, "Hey, I now want to take a look at disintermediating VMware as my virtualization software because I'm looking at Nutanix and it comes loaded with software that's in a single form factor that's highly commoditized. And I want to be able to utilize the native hypervisor in that box to be able to provide virtualization in the environment." All right. Well, in order to do that, you've got to look at the workloads that you want to drive, but you also have to look at the network considerations, right? I'm going to set that into data center. The type of workloads that I'm going to be pushing through this, I now may need to resize the direct internet circuit that I have. And if I'm pushing this from point to point, I may have to resize the MPLS circuits that I've got. So, from my perspective, it's getting more complex out there because, as Dieter said, the fast pace of new technologies that are being pushed into the marketplace requires that organizations build teams that have cross functionality and competencies to look at their total investment in that technology roadmap.
Guys, I think we're getting the high sign. D. Anthony, give you just a couple of seconds to wrap it up for us, and we may get Tyrone coming in and directing us to the next session. But D, do you want to just take 15 for a final comment? D.
Yeah,
Anthony?
I'll make it short and sweet, Phil. So for us, you need to fund your programs, right? Like a venture capitalist would. And so when Ed was talking about the complexity, break them up so they're not as complex and have value at each one of them. So that's the key piece. More about this, and I'll do a plug for myself later on this afternoon when I have a discussion presentation on this very topic. Phil?
Beautiful. So it sounds like have a team, have a plan, fund it the right way, and be diligent about it are the keys. So guys, thanks very much for everybody listening today. We appreciate the questions and your time and interest in this critical subject. We're certainly able to answer questions in the chats or individual communications through the Brella tool as we move through the rest of our day 2 for Source IT. So thanks for all for listening, and Ed and Dee and Dieter, thanks for joining me this morning. Good to catch up with you guys and have a good chat. And I think we'll turn it over to our good friend Tyrone Magby to take us forward in the day.
Excellent. Thanks, Dee. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Dieter. What a great panel and discussion. We really appreciate it.